thank you guys again for joining us for the feline leukemia section of today's AMPA presentation. Welcome to the safest city in the country to be a cat, and definitely the safest city in the country to be a feline leukemia positive cat. We're super, super excited to have Dr. Julie Levy here, who is one of my professional heroes and has done more to save cats than probably any research scientist in the world. Our amazing feline leukemia manager, Natascha Hamman. And we're going to get you started with what you need to know about feline leukemia for shelter decision making. So the current state of things for cats in this country who are diagnosed with feline leukemia is still really pretty grim. These are one of the last few % of cats to be saved. They're almost always killed at shelters as soon as they get that little blue dot on the wrong side of their point of care test. What we have found is it's entirely due to outdated myths, unfounded fears, and confusion, and all of those fears start at the point of testing. So we're going to talk a lot about testing today. Our current options for testing for cats include point of care, so that's what you're doing in-house. It's your little snap test or your little 15-minute combo that you're running in your clinic. You can send out for IFA, often for confirmation, or PCR, which probably not many of you are doing. But those are the three big ones that we use in shelters. And what we've run into is a lot of argument about which one of these should we be using, which one is best, which one is the most accurate. And you've probably all got some examples in your mind of when you have tested and you've gotten confusing results and you wonder, what test am I supposed to be using? What's the most accurate? And so Dr. Levy is going to lead us into the next stage, talking about our study and why we started looking at what kind of testing shelters should be using.
So Butterbean is a cat that really triggered our interest in this research. Butterbean has a very interesting story. Butterbean came into Austin Pets Alive, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is this large animal shelter here in Austin, Texas. It admits between 3,000 and 5,000 cats per year, so it's been growing in terms of saving cats. And their tradition has been to test all cats for FeLV and FIV with an IDEXX SNAP test, and typically using whole blood. We're going to talk a lot about what samples are tested in this session because that's a point of confusion. So the nice thing about cats, you can get a very small blood sample and run that whole blood on a test. And then if they got a positive, they would spin down that blood and then run it again on a serum. And the expectation was that if cats were negative on the serum and positive on the whole blood, that was evidence of a false positive. And now we know that not to be true. So that's one of the things to tuck back in your mind of, oh, things I thought were true that were not. That whole blood is actually the correct sample. They also adopt out all their FeLV positive cats, and because this program is becoming more widespread and well known, they're now adopting out hundreds of cats a year. And because of that notoriety, they're also transferring in many cats from other areas and even other countries. So here's Butterbean's story. This is Butterbean's baby picture. He first came through this shelter through their neonatal bottle baby program. And like many bottle babies, he was raised. He was FeLV negative when he was neutered and adopted out at 2 months of age. So far, very traditional, happy story of a young cat that gets tested and adopted. 4 years later, though, he was returned to the shelter because he wasn't getting along with another cat in the household. At that time, there was their protocol to retest cats that had been returned, and they had a faint positive on whole blood, serum, and plasma. So they did all these different samples. And then they would email me these because we were trying to sort out what his status was. So for the first 3 months, he tested positive on whole blood consistently. Plasma and serum have gone back and forth between testing positive and negative. Last month, he tested negative on all of the tests, including IFA and PCR. So they have really gone above and beyond in testing this cat. He's never tested positive on IFA or PCR. And this month, he went back to testing positive on whole blood, plasma, and serum. They said, he is the epitome of it's complicated. And these are the kinds of stories that fill my voicemail every week because people are trying to do this routine testing and then they come across these cats that just aren't following any rules. So we said, let's go big. Let's design this Awesome Pets Alive study, test a bunch of positive cats with all of the tests, and we're going to repeat that testing every month for 6 months. And surely by the end of that, we will have some answers. So we wanted to know what's the best sample. Should we be using whole blood or something else? And which is the best test? And we're not talking about test brands so much because we already know that, but we're talking about should we be doing point of care tests, sending tests to the lab, IFAs, PCRs. And then we also wanted to know how many cats that came in as positive on the first test would eventually convert to negative, because that happens. And then what was the survival of those cats, at least for the first 6 months that we were following them. So by design, we tracked these cats with serial panels for 6 months. These cats lived in either in the FeLV sanctuary in the shelter, but mostly were put out in foster homes during the duration of this study. And the foster homes agreed to bring these cats back, and Natascha was the enforcement arm of that, continuing to be in the study so that we didn't lose any samples over time, including going out and getting the cats if people couldn't drive them. And they also, the people that fostered these cats were very committed to this study, and they were advocates for saving FeLV positive cats. So they also had their own community of helpfulness. We also tested a group of FeLV negative cats just to compare how they did on the study, but I'm not going to get into that side of the study today because we don't have time. This was a very big study, probably cost about $300,000 total. The IDEX donated that testing, and then Maddie's fund donated all of the cash. And then most recently, we have had a donation from Wynn Feline Foundation to continue this work after the 6-month study was over. So how did it work? This is Natascha picking up a cat at the airport as it's coming into Austin. These are local cats and cats that were transferred in from shelters across the country. They were housed in these foster homes for the most part, or in a special room at the shelter, and then they were adopted at the end of this study. So after 6 months, they actually became official pets of people. Here's the testing panel that we ran. It's quite extensive, and I'm not even going to share all the results, like the culture results today, but they had to collect 8 mils of blood from each cat, which if you have tried to collect blood, you know how difficult that is. And so Natascha became really an expert in handling the cats and collecting the blood. And it was very important to us that the cats not be stressed by this process. And so cats that seemed to be stressed by giving blood, we actually let them leave the study because we were very committed to the welfare of the cats as well. So here it is what we did. All this blood was sent off to a lab to be run in a blinded way, that nobody knew what the results of the cat were, and tests were run on laboratory conditions. So as we go through the results, think like this is best case scenario. In the real world, where people don't run tests as rigorously, things will only get worse. So that IDEX SNAP combo test, which tests for P27 antigen proteins for FeLV, we ran it 3 times, whole blood, plasma, and serum from the same sample. The lab also has a plate test that they ran, and that was run on plasma and serum. And then IDEX also ran their PCR. We sent our IFAs to the National Vet Lab. I'm going to give you one other just practice tip. That's the only lab that we trust for IFAs. So this is one where you need to mail it out to a specific lab. And they invented this test in the 70s, and it still remains the most reliable test. We're not comfortable with the quality of the tests for IFA that come back from the national reference labs. So if you're going to run IFAs, make sure you send it to this specific lab. So just to give you a sense of the data set that we're still churning through, we had 130 FeLV positive cats. Every cat had 7 sample dates, and then each of our negative cats had 1 sample date. So we started off with 1,000 blood samples, and each of those samples had IFA, PCR, 3 SNAPs, 2 PET checks, and that was 7,000 tests. So in the end, we had over 13,000 results. So for those of you who've been waiting patiently for results, hopefully you give us a little bit of a break, because this is a lot of data analysis that we're working through, and we're chunking it into little bites that we can make sense of. I'll say with all of that, this great investment in the study that we made, I'm going to tell you that it did not reveal the easy answers that we wanted. So this is where we're going to ask you to participate. This is one cat's results. Yonley, it's cat number 20, Yonley 26 was his name. Natascha can probably tell you like where those names came from, but they had some cute names and then some numbers. And this came into the study as a 3-month-old female cat that was FeLV positive on a SNAP test. And what you see here is a panel. I'm going to show you several of them. So this is month 0. This is this cat's initial test, and you can see that this cat is negative across the board on all of the different tests. So everybody has to vote now. I'm going to ask you 2 questions, or I'll ask you, do you think this cat is infected, or do you think this cat is non-infected? And I can tell you this is not a trick question. So just imagine yourself in your shelter. You get these results. How many think this cat is infected? How many think he's not infected? All right. So this is a little bit of a softball cat. He is negative across the board. He stays negative on every single test. We can be confident as we can ever be, this cat is not infected. Okay, how about this cat? Ocho Rios is a 6-year-old male castrate. And at month 0, he's positive across all of his tests. So raise your hand if you think he's infected. And who thinks he's not infected? All right. So this cat plays the rule book, and he stays infected across all of these tests. So these are cats that they don't keep you up at night. How about this cat? So he is positive on whole blood, but negative on everything else, including spinning down that SNAP test, and negative on serum, which is what many shelters have done in the past and many veterinarians do, and they call that cat negative. So here you have, he's only positive on the whole blood SNAP. Everything else is negative. So raise your hand if you think he's infected. And if he's uninfected. I'm seeing some audience drop off here. It might progress. So this is a cat that we'd like, is this a false positive? Is he just on that knife edge between a progressive infection and a regressive infection? It would be more comfortable to call him a false positive if we had not tested him again a month later and he did the same thing. So this is when you start to go, what room do I put him in? What do I tell the person who's adopting him? Do I just report those later results that make everything easy? All right. Jasper. So this cat is in a group of cats, maybe 25% of the cats out of 130 fall into this more queasy category of lack of clarity. So what you see is he is positive on all of his SNAP tests. He is negative on the tests that you send to the lab. So a lot of times when people say, I ran the SNAP test and then I sent it to the lab for confirmation, this is the test they would do, and it was negative in the lab. But then the cat was positive for PCR. The IFA was indeterminate. And so they do quality control and they're just like, we can't call it. So how many people think this cat is infected? And how many think he's not? And how many are reluctant to call the status? Okay. There we go. So look what this cat does to us over time. So if you're obviously not going to test a cat with 10 different tests every month before you are comfortable releasing him from your shelter with a status on his medical record. So what if you had randomly screened this cat at month 3 with a SNAP test? You would not be aware of any of this drama that is in this cat's background. Or in month 5, if you had even been suspicious, maybe he'd been exposed to another cat, so you sent some blood to the lab too, you would miss it just based on that time. So the story we're starting to tell here is a single test, single point of time, and which test you select may not be representative of the true status of that cat. We're starting to really think of these cats maybe as something they're in balance with all their life, and when their immune system is really strong, they beat that virus back, and so you're not going to see it. And then if they have a stressor, like they get sick or they get put in a shelter or they have kittens, then you may see this starting to rise to a detectable level. And this can become a real trap of continuous testing, and that's one of the questions I get from people is we ran a test, and we ran a PCR, and then we ran an IFA, and they all disagree, and this cat can't live here the rest of his life. He needs to go to a home. And finally, with T-Rex, How many people think this cat's infected? He stays this strongly infected status that we'd all be comfortable with until month 4, where he is negative across the board. So again, if you had randomly tested this cat at month 4, that's when he happened to come in, you'd miss him. And then he starts to creep back to positive in month 5. And this is one where we would definitely go, oh, somebody mislabeled the tube, right? This doesn't make sense. We went back and retested, and we confirmed this was his true test results. So just tuck that all in the back of your mind. That is $300,000 worth of work, a couple years of our life, to get these 6 cats, to get the 6 months of data from all of these cats. So our results, this is the outcome of the 130 cats. 3 we withdrew because they became too frail to stay in the study. 4 died during the study period. 18 were euthanized. So our completion for 6 months of the 105 cats was 81%. So we were really happy with that. We wanted to make sure we had at least 100 cats that got all the way through the study so we could have good statistics. So here's all the exciting outcome. Of the 96 juvenile and adult cats, so this is all the cats that are 2 months of age and older than at their first test, we called 75% of these progressive infections. These were cats that were always positive on all of the tests. So 3 out of the 4 infected cats really didn't give us trouble. But then we had 22% that were regressive or discordant. And these are the ones that either they sort of disappear into negative land, or they give you really weak positives, or they're discordant on different tests. Interestingly, and this is a part of the study we want to follow up on more, is Awesome Pets Alive has this big neonatal kitten program with thousands of kittens to go through it. And so they test every kitten that when it comes in, even if it's a day old. So they have a lot of information. And then those cats get retested again when it's adoption age. And so of the 34 kittens that were first tested at less than 2 months of age, only half of them stayed in the progressive category, and half of them were in this more regressive stage or went completely negative. So this is an interesting thing that we did not expect to see, but we're wondering if there's something about those tiny kittens, less than 2 months old, that if they test positive, they're actually more likely to either fight off the infection or maybe they were never even infected in the first place. And we're sort of planning another study to parse that out. We did have 6 cats that we call recovered in quotes because all of the tests were negative by 6 months of age. So 5% either went totally regressive or actually fought off the virus. But most of the cats are going to stay positive, and that's a take-home message. So to summarize our results of our study is that you should know, and feel free to take a picture of this because it's a go-home for you, is whole blood is the most sensitive sample for serologic detection. But those cats that are weak positive on whole blood and then negative on serum probably have a better prognosis for going into that regressive state. They are fighting off the virus. A cat that is whole blood positive and IFA PCR negative is probably a better prognosis. They are infected, but they may be living a long life with their virus. And that certainly our current definitions of progressive and regressive infection are not capturing the true status of the cat. We as guidelines developers need to dig into more to create categories that reflect what's really happening in the cats. It truly is not possible to define a cat's true status with one test. And so that's what is triggering the discussion about whether we should be investing in doing one test on every cat if we think the results are complicated. And then because this was so fascinating, the Win Feline Foundation did come out. We think it's essential to follow these cats for a lifetime to find out what happened to them and can we tie their prognosis or their long-term outcome to some testing patterns early on. And we will come back to some of this, and we'll have lots of time over lunch to talk about details, and I would love to hear over lunch your stories of difficult cases and what you did with them and you handled them. But now I'm going to turn it over to Monica to initiate the discussion about should we be testing or not.
Thank you. Did we thoroughly confuse everyone with the test results yet? Do you guys all have too much money in your shelter? Right? So this starts a conversation about if our test results are this confusing, and maybe they're not even telling us anything accurate about the state of the cat when we test, and they're costing y'all a whole lot of money At EPA, we spend over $75,000 a year just on tests. Should we be testing? This is a slide showing the prevalence of feline leukemia and FIV across the country. So you can see that it's about 2 or 3% across the country. Should you be spending $75,000 a year to catch 2 or 3% of your cats? What about if that test doesn't really tell you anything to begin with? Would that $75,000 be better placed using in a different program that saved the lives of more cats more directly, maybe more RTF, more spay-neuter, more medical? So this is an important conversation that's really starting to come to the forefront in 2019 about should we even be testing at all? And it's not uncommon at all for shelters to say we don't test at all. So our testing recommendations basically come down to if you are not saving all of the cats in your community, don't test. If you are saving all of the cats in your community and you have resources, then go ahead and test, but only if you are using it as a diagnostic tool. You cannot use this test as a culling tool, which is what happens in this country. You get that little blue dot in the wrong place and the cat is killed. And as we've seen on the previous slides, it's a complete shot in the dark about what that test shows on that day. It does not necessarily indicate what the cat will look like tomorrow. So if you are a shelter and you are struggling with funds and you are not saving all of your cats, I would much rather you put your testing money into something that proven saves the lives of cats. Only if you are going to guarantee a positive outcome, a live outcome to every cat you test, should you be testing. Does that make sense to everybody? If you're going to test, this is the next big piece that I want you to go home with. If you're still going to test at intake, please make sure you do it right. The brand of test you're using matters, and we're going to talk specifics about that. The method that you're using matters. All of those point-of-care tests are very sensitive in how you use them, and I know my techs, I've worked with a lot of you in the room, nobody is doing these perfect under lab conditions, right? We're not all letting the temperature warm up to room temperature on our tests and using the little dropper. None of us are doing it. I know we're not. That matters, though. And you've got to understand that if you are testing, today's test result may be totally different than tomorrow's test result, so what are you going to do about it? And I want you to pay attention to this little graph up here. This is a study from Dr. Levy, where she looked at the different point-of-care tests that are available and their sensitivity and their specificity. And she's going to give you a little quiz on these in a second and ask you which test you might use. Also from Dr. Levy's study with IDEX, this is a comparison of some different brand tests, and it talks about in high-stakes testing, meaning that if a positive test comes up, the cat would be killed. Accuracy could be life and death. These are two different tests that are available, Witness and VetScan, and it's Witness on the left there, and you can see that the Witness test resulted in a positive that was more likely wrong than right. On the right is a VetScan rapid test, and the result was more often wrong than right. So let that sit in for a little minute. Let that sink in. If you've been using Witness or VetScan, your positive results were more often wrong than right, and we are making life and death decisions based on that. Brand matters. So Dr. Levy's going to pick us up again and talk about the best practices for leukemia testing in shelters if you're going to continue testing.
So testing is difficult just biologically because of how cats are reacting to their virus, and then we can add a lot of complexity and error by how we choose to test in our testing protocols. So one of the things to do is pick a good test. So the cheapest test is not the best test. The best test really for point-of-care testing is the IDEX test, and it is the most expensive, takes up the most room in the refrigerator, so it's not convenient and cheap, but it is the very best one. I see an error because people are spending enormous amounts of money on this. They're trying to find ways to reduce their testing costs. So one thing that is common but inappropriate practice is to put multiple samples together into one test. For example, take a little blood from each kitten in a litter, mix it up in the tube, and then run one test for the litter. And the problem with that is if one of the cats is a weak positive, it might be diluted below the detection of that test. Another thing that is often misunderstood is that a group of cats does not necessarily have all the same results. So we see mixed litters all of the time. So some kittens are positive, some are negative, and they are all at risk for being positive because they're obviously all exposed to a positive cat. But we see decisions being made for the whole litter, like euthanize the whole litter, or if you identify, maybe just testing the mother and assuming that her status is going to reflect the status of the kittens. We see that mixed all the time too. And you might miss infected kittens just by testing a mother who's testing negative at that time, or vice versa. Mom may be positive, and her kittens can be negative. Also, feral cat colonies. I see people, I say, oh, we've got 100 cats in this colony, so we're going to go test 3 or 5, and that will give us an idea if there's an FeLV problem with that. And with the stats that Monica showed you, the prevalence is usually around 5%. So the chances that you're actually going to find FeLV randomly by testing just a couple cats are very low. So that kind of use of testing, either mixing samples together or assuming that one cat is a surrogate for another cat, is very inappropriate. So if you are going to test, pick a good test, perform it properly, and perform one cat has one test. All right, so here's the exam. Which is the best test? So the one on the top is the IDEX SNAP, the most expensive one. The second one is Zoetis Witness. The third one is BioNote, and that's one in Europe. We can't get it here. And then the Abaxis VetScan is the last one there. So, well, let's start first with a poll of what people are using. Raise your hand if you're using the IDEX SNAP test. How about the Witness test, Zoetis? And how about Abaxis VetScan? So, the results that Monica showed you is because of the sensitivity and specificity, the accuracy was highest with the IDEX test. It was next highest with the Zoetis test, and it was unacceptably low with the Abaxis test. And so we strongly recommend not using the Abaxis test. This is also true for their parvo test because we have been very misled about parvo outbreaks and panleuk outbreaks based on the Abaxis VetScan. I'm not familiar with the accuracy of their heartworm tests, and so that, but because 2 of the other tests are pretty poor, I wouldn't use that as well. So if you have the resources to use the best, I would use the SNAP test. If for some reason you need to buy something that's like a third the cost, use the Witness test and then don't use anything else. Is that helpful or clear? Okay. And then I have just, I'll bring it to lunch, but we have what all the different tests look like in case you want to see those. Okay, so what are we going to do in shelters? We have to make decisions, and it's whether we are going to treat them like individual cats, test every cat according to the AAFP guidelines, or can we be selective in applying our resources so that the money that we do have and the technician time that we have is spent having the best outcome for cats. So shelter testing. These are my thoughts. If screening is performed, I think generally one and done for most cases is most appropriate. You can definitely get down a rabbit hole of feeling like you need to run a lot of confirmatory tests if a positive comes up, and it's generally not going to help clarify anything. You're just going to get a mix of test results that are confusing. So it can be a very slippery slope. It can take a lot of time and often not get you the answer that you wanted. It is becoming more complex and confusing because of these new results that we have, and because the status of the cat actually changes over time. It's something we didn't appreciate before this study. So here is my suggestion for a routine testing protocol if that's what your shelter is going to do. So take that point of care test, and which brands do we recommend? The IDEX SNAP and Witness, right. Zoetis Witness. Now, a complication has occurred in that Zoetis has just bought Abaxis. So Zoetis now owns a good test and a bad test, and I don't know what they're going to do with that, or if we'll know. So one point of care test, it's either positive or negative. If you feel like you need to go to a 2-step process, this is what we recommend, is of the positive cats, run an IFA. Where would you run that IFA? Yes, National Veterinary Lab. This is not one you send to IDEX or Antec where your other lab work goes. Or PCR. We just love also IDEX for their PCR. If it's positive, okay, you can walk away. You've confirmed that cat is infected. If it's negative, now you have a discordant cat, and it's always going to be confusing. If for some reason you think a cat is really high risk, like it came from a litter that was positive or a hoarding case that had a lot of positive, you can retest them in 30 days to have more confidence about a negative cat that was recently exposed. And then finally, it is important, you guys probably aren't doing a lot of blood transfusions, but regressively infected cats that test negative on all of their screening tests still can transmit the virus when you blood transfuse cats. So if you need to do a blood transfusion, we do recommend advanced testing of those donor cats by PCR to reduce the risk of missing a regressive infection that can transmit it. So what do you do with all this information? Monica already asked, should all shelter cats be tested? And I'll start with the easy one because we've kind of had this battle, and it seems like we pretty much all agree, is stray and feral community cats. So raise your hand if you're doing any kind of TNR or return to field. And then leave your hand up if you test those cats routinely. So this is what I find, is most groups have decided that they really need to focus their resources on getting more cats neutered. That's how TNR has impact. And things we do that are good things, like microchipping and testing and raising the kittens up and taming them, all of those things have value in another circumstance. But if you are trying to do high-impact TNR to better the welfare of cats in your community, then skipping testing is definitely something to do. And also, veterinarians are usually the ones that are most anxious about this, and remind them that by neutering these cats, you are impacting the biggest way that they're spread. So FeLV is primarily spread from infected mother cats to their kittens, and FIV is primarily spread among male cats that fight, and both of that is vastly reduced by TNR. So we can fight these viruses and overpopulation faster by just really ramping up our TNR programs to be neutering thousands of cats, not hundreds of cats. So this is pretty easy exception. We also know that the prevalence of these viruses in outdoor cats, outdoor roaming pet cats, is about the same as in the community cats. So there's really no benefit of targeting only the community cats. All right, what about cats in single housing in the shelter? So we're not talking about isolating these cats, but say you have just a lot of single cat housing, cages in your shelter, and so the cats are not mixed. Raise your hand if you're in a shelter or rescue that has cats that way, or at least some of your cats are that way, and keep your hand up if you're testing those cats. So that's still common, and what I can say is this is what Monica shared with you, is you can look at your resources and how many cats that you're saving, and if you can reallocate those resources to save more cats, then do it. If for some reason you have unlimited funds and you really can test and it works for you, that's fine too. But this virus is not spread easily. So you can pet that cat, feed it, take care of it, and then go do the same thing to the next cat in the next cage, and you cannot contaminate this virus. We have lots of data that shows a positive group and a negative group separated by chain link fencing never spread this virus. So this is so different than upper respiratory infections and distemper and parvo that just spreads on your hands and your clothes. This does not. So they need no special housing. And in fact, they should not be in the isolation ward where you put your sick cats because they may be more sensitive to other infections. So definitely, if you're going to start down the road of reducing your testing, this is a really safe, easy way to start. What about cats in group housing? So raise your hand if you have group house cats, and keep your hand up if you test those cats before they go into group housing. Yeah, so I think this makes sense. As we know, we're not sure how infectious it is. It's not like Pan-Luc, but this is a higher risk behavior, is to put cats that are infected closely housed with cats that are not infected. So this might be a subset that you go ahead and test before the cats go in. Queens with kittens. Raise your hand if you have queens with kittens. Doesn't everybody? That season is coming up. And keep your hand up and there's no shaming here because this is what a lot of of shelters do. Raise your hand if you generally or have tested the queen and just made an assumption that the kittens were the same. Yeah. And sometimes that's about, I only have 5 tests, that's how much I can afford, and I'm going to test those 5 mama cats, and that's the way it goes. So, but ideally, you would test each of those individual cats. Or, if you're not testing cats, this is where your conversations with people adopting the cats really need to be ramped up. They need to understand these cats are not tested. They need to go to their vet and get them tested before they mix them in with the rest of the household. Now, people aren't listening to a lot of instruction at the time of adoption. They're distracted. We're giving them way too much information. So we do know that a lot of these people will go mix the cats before they go to the vet. So we need to do a better job of educating, and we need to educate the vets that they're going to go to, because we don't want to surprise the local vets with a policy change that they're not prepared for, because that can backfire. Cats with wounds or illness. How many would test cats that have wounds or illness? So I agree with you. This is another high risk. This puts them in the high risk. So this cat may have been bitten by a cat that had FeLV, or if they're ill, sometimes FeLV can play a role in illness. And then we're not going to euthanize a sick cat that's FeLV positive, but we might have a different treatment plan for that cat and house it in a different place. So it gives us more information. It's like any other blood work that we do for sick animals. So this is a handout I really love, and if you email me, or I can give to Monica the full handout of this shelter's explanation about why they test less, because it was really, I thought, an excellent demonstration of they made a very well-reasoned pitch for why they had reduced testing, and they went out to the local practitioners first and got them on board with this before they started their program. So it rolled out without any controversy, and they explained that they are still testing high-risk cats, sick cats, and group house cats, but they are no longer testing single house cats and cats less than 6 months of age. I don't entirely understand the 6 month of age thing, but at least it's really clear who they test and who they didn't, and then they had documentation encouraging people to test at their local vet. All right, well, if we do test, we're going to identify some positive cats. Raise your hand if you identify positive cats from time to time. Raise your hand if euthanasia is the kind of protocol right now. Oh, our work is done. You're already here. So we want to manage these cats just like cats with any other chronic disease. They might not live 20 years, or they might live a few years, just like a cat with a heart problem or an older cat that you would adopt out. We just don't know how long cats are going to live. But if these cats are thriving now, they deserve to be in a home. So we treat the patient, not the blue dot. We try to put that blue dot in the back of our mind as it's just a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing. Many of these cats live long and healthy, and Natascha has some great stories, which I hope we have time to talk about in this session or the lunch session, of cats that really came in on death's door and anemic, and with a positive blue dot, might have been euthanized, but then they just came back to life and did great with supportive care. So I think optimism and attitude has a lot to do with whether these cats survive. For those of you who have been using interferon, ace-mannan, all kinds of other hocus pocus to make these cats live longer, there's no data for any of it that it works. So it's probably not harmful, but it is probably taking your resources away that could be better spent. So there are no products, holistic products, medical products that have been shown to help these cats. And we do want to be vigilant. These cats may be susceptible to more diseases, and so when they get a little bit sick, I just urge people to kind of not wait as long as they might with a pet cat that's having a couple bad days before going to the vet. So with this, I'm turning it over to Natascha.
So raise your hand if you are identifying positive cats and not euthanizing them. And keep your hands up if you are sending them to sanctuaries. And put your hands up if you have an active adoption program for these cats. Cool. At IPA, we take in probably around 700 FeLV positive cats who predominantly were identified at sending shelters. Several of them, 150 of them are identified as negative on an intake, and of the remaining, we adopted out 385 positive cats last year. So it is possible. And people are by far and away excited about these cats. They get something called FeLV fever, and we see again and again and again repeat adopters. In fact, yesterday I had somebody adopt their 7th FeLV cat. Even after their cats have passed away, they've come back and adopted them again and again and again. They really aren't staying much longer than the average adult cat in our shelter system, and they are actually, majority of them are adopted straight from foster homes. So people aren't just coming in and seeing a FeLV and falling in love with them. They're seeing them on our website, knowing they're FeLV positive, and adopting them anyway. What do you need to save these cats? The first step is just making them available and putting an adoption program in place. If you're euthanizing them, then you can't save them. If you're putting them in sanctuary homes, I really don't recommend doing that because they are adoptable animals. There is no reason they shouldn't be available for adoption. Any space is fine. Like Dr. Levy said, we don't need special housing for them. All they need is their own set room. I also talk about how these are great cats for like students or people who don't know where they're going to be in 5 years, that sometimes that like shorter life expectancy is actually a marketable aspect of these cats. And another thing I recommend doing is talking to your local private practice vets and finding out who is on board with saving these cats and making a short list of private practice vets who will help you and you can send your adopters to, because one of the biggest roadblocks I've seen is people who will adopt out a cat and take it to their private vet, and then that private vet says, oh, they're FeLV positive, euthanize them. This here is a slide of Monica's apprentices who have since implemented FeLV adoption programs since going to her apprenticeship. She has a whole FeLV slide part of her apprenticeships. Some of the reviews are, I'm so happy to report that the shelter where I work now has a dedicated adoption room from FeLV cats. Our first official adoption just happened. And these people, you can see how excited they are about adopting these cats. They're not like regretting that. They're not saying like, oh, I adopt out this sick animal, and they're not focused on that. What I always tell adopters is it's going to suck if you lose your cat in 1 year, but it's also going to suck if you lose your cat in 10. It's not a reason why people shouldn't adopt these animals. And I don't know a whole lot of people who would just euthanize a senior for being old or having that shorter life expectancy.
So this is just an example of how when you're planning a new program or you just want to publicize a program you already have about adopting FeLV positive cats, it's a real opportunity for publicity. And you can get articles in the newspaper about it or get your volunteers and board and staff all on board. So this was a shelter that someone had bottle raised some kittens, and when they came into the shelter, they were FeLV positive. I think actually it was the shelter veterinarian that had bottle fed these kittens. And they had euthanized all cats in the past, but this just didn't seem like the right thing to do. And so they reached out to us and we gave them some advice about how to get them adopted. And then they got their marketing department on board and they really made a thing out of it. And it was a huge success. And this is a cage card that they made, which I love this one because it is just so warm and cheerful, and it doesn't focus on the negative. They're not saying like, watch out, wash your hands because this cat's got a disease. It's like, this cat has a fabulous life ahead of it. And they also have a nice fact sheet that goes with this program that gives everybody like real good information about the FeLV disease itself and what to expect. And so having this honest disclosure with a very positive attitude and promotion has made their program very successful. And they're happy to share their information. Monica's also got all of their information about the FeLV program that can be shared. So good handouts and things that are already written, so you don't have to start from scratch. You just like scratch out the name change and put your shelter's name on there. We really want to help you be successful. So here's the trends that we're talking about at this time. is that testing represents one point of time. This is a real take-home message. Might not be accurately reflecting that cat's lifetime status. That mass testing is not always the best way to use your resources. And we had that very volatile discussion about TNR, and it was controversial at the time, and you can see now everybody's like, oh, of course you don't test in TNR. We can also move our shelters to that. Testing of individually housed cats for sure is not essential, and that's sometimes a good place to start. It's still vital that if you are going to test, do it right. One test per cat, follow the instructions, pick a good test. Please don't use testing as a culling tool, but really as an opportunity to identify cats that you can promote for their own value and save them. And this will require a lot of education, so not to say there's not a lot of time involved, and I think some upfront time is a good investment so that, especially with the local veterinarians, either to get them all on board or to identify those that really are happy to work with these cats and are going to support the owner's decision and not trash talk the shelter because of what they're doing. So I think these are some really great inspiring stories from their program.
So, I don't know a lot of people who are adopting out incontinent cats, much less FeLV cats, but this is a cat in particular who is really near and dear to everybody at APA's heart. Her name was Helena. She was a senior, 7 years old. She had been adopted and returned when she developed incontinence. She was a long stay. She had been with us over 100 days at the time of her second adoption. And she also had severe stomatitis and lymphoma. So she just kind of had everything going against her. And I feel like most people might expect Helena's adopter to look a certain way. Like, for example, somebody who had cats their whole life and was searching for the cat who needed them the most. Helena's adopter had never had a pet before in her entire life. She was a 40-year-old woman, had never even had a fish. She came in and she actually emailed my other program, my matchmakers program, and asked for recommendations. And I recommended a different FeLV cat to her, and this is the one she fell in love with, this shy, incontinent FeLV cat with no teeth. And so I wanted to share a bit about their story. Here are some pictures of Helena and Jackie. The picture on the left is Helena and Jackie looking lovingly into each other's eyes. The middle is her in her diaper. This woman bought a waterproof duvet cover so her incontinent cat could sleep with her at night. And I also included a picture of Jackie and Helena at Helena's euthanasia. So Jackie here did not regret even for a moment adopting Helena. When I asked her if she wanted to be included in the slideshow, she was very enthusiastic. She wanted to tell people that despite this being her first cat and her beloved pet, she had no regrets having her for less than a year. And she immediately went on to adopt another cat with mammary cancer directly after, within a month of this cat passing away. So these cats can and do get adopted, and there really is a home for every cat out there, including continent FeLVs like Helena.
And so this wraps up our formal presentation from today, and we're very interested in continuing this conversation. We actually have a few minutes now, which surprises me. Yeah. And then we'll have lots more room for discussion over lunch. And I wanted to make sure that everybody knows about the Million Cat Challenge. This was a project funded by Maddie's fund. It's in shelters across North America, and the goal was to help shelters save 1 million more cats over 5 years than their baseline. And our shelters actually knocked it out of the park, and they reached that goal a year early. So the project was extended because it was such a success, and our new tagline is all the cats. And what this means is we're really looking for solutions that help shelters find the right outcome for every cat. So that might be adoption or staying in their home where they already are, or returning to their home in the community, or coming to the shelter for recovery from a disease, or in cases where humane euthanasia is the right thing, including euthanasia. So help us find the right outcome for every cat. And if you're not yet signed up in the Million Cat Challenge to get the information that we're sharing, please do. You just go online, millioncatchallenge.org, fill out the the survey. Right now we are in data collection mode, so in a month or two we'll be able to share out how our shelters did in the past year for reducing euthanasia. And I can say a sneak peek from the data that's flying in now is it's going to knock everybody's socks off. Things are looking really bright for cats in shelters.
Okay, thank you guys so much.